Thank you again for joining us for today's discussion on EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt's Benefits Busting Cost Benefit Analysis proposal. Before we begin today's discussion, please allow me to introduce our presenters. They are both experts on cost benefit analysis and have been featured in several articles on Pruitt's proposal. Amy Sinden is the James E. Beasley Professor of Law at the Temple University Beasley School of Law in Philadelphia and a board member at the Center for Progressive Reform. James Goodwin is the Senior Policy Analyst at CPR. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all of you for joining us today on this very, very important topic. It seems like this rulemaking it would seem like a highly technical inside baseball kind of policy change, but it will have really far-reaching consequences, so it's really important to pay attention to this now. Before I dive into the rulemaking, I wanted to take a quick moment to introduce the Center for Progressive Reform to those of you who are not familiar with our organization. CPR is a public policy think tank that is comprised of more than 60 working academics based throughout the United States, work with professional staff based in Washington, D.C., to help bring their scholarship on environmental matters, regulatory policy, and these sorts of things, and apply them to live policy debates. My colleague Amy Sinden, who's joining us today, is one of the member scholars, and I'm one of the professional staff who works for CPR. We've worked in a variety of fields of regulatory policy and environmental policy, but one area we've specialized in for over 15 years is cost-benefit analysis, and that's why we've gravitated towards this rulemaking and decided to put a lot of effort into understanding and helping members of the public understand it, and policymakers and the press as well. So like I said, this is a really important rulemaking. It's not inside baseball type of stuff, and will have really far-reaching consequences for how EPA carries out its business. Some context for it is important to bear in mind. For one thing, it's useful to think of this rulemaking as part of the Trump administration's broader assault on public safeguards, which he's carrying out to favor the powerful special interests he's allied himself with during his term in office. We've seen him carry out this assault in various ways, most notably through things like his executive order that would require agencies like the EPA to repeal 2 existing rulemakings before they can issue new ones, which has led to a lot of deregulatory actions and largely stymied the development and implementation of new rulemaking. But this rulemaking is also can be seen as part of Administrator Scott Pruitt's campaign to fundamentally reorient the way in which EPA carries out its work, and to do so in a way that prioritizes corporate polluters' interests ahead of the public interest. As much as Pruitt would like to, he can't unilaterally weaken laws like the Clean Air Act or the Safe Water Act. Only Congress has that authority. But what he's trying to do is achieve that same goal by subverting them and how they're ultimately implemented. And this advance notice of proposed rulemaking on cost-benefit analysis illustrates that strategy. Amy will explain in a moment. What this rule seeks to do is empower Pruitt in key ways, or the EPA in key ways, to evade how these laws are supposed to be implemented in ways that undermines their environmental and public health goals. Another example of this strategy that Pruitt is carrying out is another rulemaking that many of you might be familiar with, which is the censored science rule. So taken together, these 2 rulemakings almost represent a 1-2 punch for weakening how EPA carries out its statutory mission of protecting public health and the environment, with the cost-benefit analysis rule aimed at weakening how, or rigging essentially how EPA considers economics in rulemaking, and the censored science rule focused on rigging, how EPA ultimately incorporates considerations of science into its decision-making processes. Another reason we should care about this rulemaking is because Scott Pruitt seems to have made it clear that he doesn't want us, the public, to be able to influence this rulemaking or to make our views known about it. We've seen that this rulemaking was the product of at various stages of its development. Scott Pruitt and the White House have taken steps to shut out the ability of the public to weigh in on this rulemaking, and this advance notice is another example of that. And in particular, with the advance notice, he only provided a 30-day comment period, which is just unacceptably short for rulemaking that's as technical and raises so many complicated issues. This really short comment period suggests that Pruitt just isn't interested in hearing what the public says about or thinks about this rule. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Amy Sinden, who will explain some of our initial substantive concerns with the rulemaking itself.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us. I sort of feel like we have to start with, where did this idea that cost-benefit analysis ought to be a metric for setting regulatory standards, where did that idea come from? It traces back to 1981, when you had a bunch of industry lobbyists who were disgruntled about the enormous wave of environmental, public health, consumer protection, and so on statutes that had come through Congress in the 1970s. For the first time, industry was being asked to clean up their own messes, and they didn't like it. So they went to the newly elected Ronald Reagan, whose ear they had, and asked him to impose through executive order this cost-benefit analysis requirement, so that all federal agencies issuing major regulations would have to perform a cost-benefit analysis on the regulation before issuing it. Their thinking was this: they figured, look, at a minimum, at least, we'll delay regulation. We'll bollocks it up in the agencies while they're scratching their heads trying to figure out how are they going to put a dollar figure on, things like public health and environmental benefits and so on. And they thought, and maybe, we'll even also succeed in weakening some regulations, because after all, the costs will be much easier to measure in dollar terms than the environmental benefits will be, and the result may well be that costs will be overemphasized in comparison to benefits, which will be underemphasized, which will have the effect of making regulation less stringent. So that happens in 1981. 1993, President Clinton comes into office and thinks about it for a while, rescinds the Reagan order, but then issues his own version of the same thing, which was softened around the edges a bit, but leaves in place this same cost-benefit analysis requirement for all major federal regulation. And that executive order remains in effect today. So meanwhile, back in the 1970s, when all of these environmental and public health statutes were passed, Congress knew about this idea of cost-benefit analysis. But in most of the statutes, Congress rejected cost-benefit analysis in favor of alternative tools for regulatory standard setting that don't require agencies to get into this messy business of trying to put dollar values on environmental and public health benefits. And in some instances, Congress even outright prohibited the agencies from using cost-benefit analysis in environmental and public health standard setting. So the result is that what we have today and have had for the last number of decades is this sort of bizarre contradiction. In many instances, you have the statute telling the EPA one thing about how they need to set standards, and then you have this executive order saying the opposite, saying, no, you have to use cost-benefit analysis. Now, if we think back to sort of, junior high school civics or whatever, I think we can figure out that when there's a conflict between a law passed by Congress and an executive order that's simply an order signed by the President, the executive order has to yield, right? The statutes control, the executive order has to yield. This is an important point because the advance notice of proposed rulemaking is very misleading on this point. It creates the impression that in fact, well, and I'll quote, it says at one point, most statutory provisions require or allow some consideration of costs and benefits when setting regulatory standards. This is technically true if you put the emphasis on allow, maybe, although this is a little bit unclear still under court decisions. Technically perhaps true, but very misleading by omission. What the agency neglected to mention was the fact that some statutes actually prohibit cost-benefit analysis. And most striking is the omission of the big Supreme Court case of Whitman versus American Trucking, which came down in 2001, in which none other than Justice Scalia held that with respect to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which are essentially the centerpiece of the Clean Air Act, EPA is not allowed to use cost-benefit analysis in setting those standards. So the omission of any mention of that case from the advance notice is really striking, particularly when you see they even have a paragraph in there that says, it talks about what they call, relevant Supreme Court cases. Whitman, of course, is missing. One of the problems here is that these misleading statements in the advance notice have actually been interpreted by the press. There have been articles in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post that said many environmental laws require cost-benefit analysis. And that is simply false. But it's not surprising given the sort of misleading drafting of this advance notice. The fact that the statutes trump this cost-benefit and the cost-benefit analysis executive order is something that has been very frustrating to industry for some time. They would prefer that the standard for all environmental standard setting be cost-benefit analysis. And what they really want is for Congress to pass what's been called a super mandate. This would be a statute passed through both houses of Congress, signed by the President, that would say essentially what the executive order says, that no agency can issue a major federal regulation without first determining that the benefits justify the cost. They have been unable, after decades of trying, to get such a super mandate through Congress. So in some sense, what you can look at this advance notice of proposed rulemaking from Pruitt's EPA as sort of industry trying to get the next best thing, right, which would be to enshrine the cost-benefit analysis requirement in regulation as well as executive order. My fear, and of course we don't know exactly what the proposed rule is going to look like at this point. My fear is that they will propose a rule that will in fact require all standard setting to be based on a cost-benefit analysis. If they do that, that will violate lots of statutory provisions, but it will of course require litigation to resolve those questions and get such a regulation struck down. Another theme in the advance notice that I think is worth pointing out is a sort of striking solicitousness toward industry and industry concerns, while simultaneously utterly ignoring the concerns of environmentalists. You can see this sort of very saliently and explicitly. For example, on pages 5 to 6 of the notice, where EPA gives two specific examples. They say, we've gotten over the years a number of comments from the public about cost-benefit analysis. And then they give two examples. Both of them are from industry. One of them explicitly said, industry has been complaining, blah, blah, blah. And then the second one is the concern about co-benefits, which is something that I'll talk about in a minute, which is another big industry concern. And that's all fine, but you would expect that it would then say, and on the other side, environmentalists have said blah, 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 blah. That paragraph is entirely missing from the document. In fact, I guess NRDC made an effort to go and meet with OIRA about this advance notice of proposed rulemaking and was denied that meeting. So let me, before I finish up here, let me just say my last thing I want to talk about is this issue of co-benefits. So this is one of the particular ways in which the advance notice of proposed rulemaking suggests. It's sort of one of the particular changes that the notice suggests that its proposed rule might make. And I want to just explain that issue. And I guess it starts with kind of going back to the fact that I alluded to early at the beginning, that for the vast majority of the pollutants that EPA regulates, the agency simply doesn't have the data to quantify, let alone monetize, the benefits of reducing those pollution levels. We just don't have the epidemiological or other kinds of data, public health data. There is one big exception to that. One pollutant with respect to which, for a series of reasons that are quite peculiar to that one pollutant, we have managed to, over the last several decades, produce a fair amount of epidemiological data on its public health impact, and that's particulate matter. And this has to do with both chemical nature of particulate matter that makes it easier to actually monitor levels of particulate matter in the ambient air. It also has to do with the fact that there are at least some fairly severe health impacts caused by particulate matter that are fairly immediate in their effect, which makes the epidemiology much easier to do than it is when the health impact is something like cancer that may have a 20-year latency period. As a result, there is an enormous amount of literature showing really nasty health effects from particulate matter. This is really bad stuff. It's causing a lot of respiratory illness, a lot of cardiovascular illness, and killing a lot of people every year. And it just so happens that while particulate matter is only one of a long, long list of air pollutants that EPA has been directed by Congress to regulate, it is one that even when EPA's purpose is to regulate a different pollutant, it just so happens that particulate matter pollution will go down at the same time as a kind of ancillary benefit of that, right? So when, for example, EPA issues its rule regulating mercury emissions from power plants, It just so happens that the same technology that reduces mercury emissions will also have a benefit of reducing particulate matter emissions. This has enabled EPA over the past number of years to generate incredibly high benefits numbers for most of the Clean Air Act rules that it has issued, even though most of those rules have as their explicit purpose the reduction of some other kind of air pollutant. Air pollutants that we know are bad, but we just don't have the data that would actually allow us to quantify exactly how bad they are. Nonetheless, EPA has been able to generate big benefits numbers in those instances in their cost-benefit analyses because of the incredible data that they have on particulate matter. As a matter of basic textbook economics, this counting of the what are called the co-benefits or the ancillary benefits of particulate matter is entirely proper. I mean, I think it would be difficult to find an economist that would tell you anything otherwise. And in fact, it sort of makes common sense. I mean, if you really think about it, the costs of a regulation are also ancillary in a certain sense, in the sense that they're not the purpose of the regulation. They are simply an ancillary effect of the regulation. So in the same way that we measure the costs of regulations when we do cost-benefit analysis, we also measure all of the benefits to society as a whole, and that's what economic theory tells you to do. So this is clearly in the advance notice one of the things that EPA is thinking about going after, and that's not surprising given that these enormous benefit numbers generated by the data on particulate matter have been driving industry crazy, and they are wanting some way to be able to jettison those big numbers from the analysis. I'm going to stop there because I may have gone over my time and let James finish up, and then we'll take questions.
Thanks, Amy. So that gives you a pretty good sense of what's at stake with this rulemaking. Now I'll quickly close up by letting everyone know what's next for the rulemaking. So where EPA is at now with this rulemaking is they issued what is known as an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And the comment period on that closes really, really soon. It closes on July 13th, which doesn't give us a ton of time to start weighing in on this rulemaking. Because of this almost absurdly short time period, many folks have submitted formal requests to EPA in recent days asking for an extension of the comment period. I know CPR has and many other public interest organizations as well. It remains to be seen whether the EPA will grant those extension requests or not. There was a similar effort with the censored science rule to seek a comment extension period, and that was granted. So I don't know if we're optimistic that we'll get one for this rulemaking as well, but it remains to be seen. After that, EPA will incorporate whatever feedback it receives from this comment period and then develop what is known as a notice of proposed rulemaking. And at that point, they'll send that out for public comment as well. At that stage, EPA should have more significant detail about what it intends to do with this rulemaking and how it would ultimately affect the manner in which EPA performs cost-benefit analyses on these rules, and we'll see to what extent our initial concerns with this rulemaking bear out. After the comment period on the notice of proposed rulemaking concludes, at that point EPA will incorporate that second round of feedback into developing a final rule, and at that point that will almost certainly trigger litigation over the rulemaking. So clearly we need to fight back against this rule. And it's important to start now, even though we're just at what is at the first step of what is sure to be a very long process. And the reason I say it's important to start fighting now is because this is an opportunity to to prevent this rulemaking from gaining any more momentum. If we can come out, those of us in the public interest community can come out and frame the debate about what this rulemaking is all about and how it would ultimately harm folks and undermine the ability of the EPA to carry out its statutory mission, then we have a good shot of discouraging EPA from either carrying this rulemaking out further or doing anything really, really extreme or drastic with it. It's also important to start now because it will help set up arguments for the inevitable litigation that's sure to result from this rulemaking if it does indeed get finalized. So with that in mind, CPR is already taking a number of steps to help respond to this rulemaking. So far, we've conducted analyses of the rule, which we've distributed some initial talking points, ways to explain the impacts of the rule and make it concrete to folks who either are unfamiliar with how EPA does its work or with what cost-benefit analysis is and the potential impact it could have on the vital safeguards we all depend upon to keep our air safe to breathe and our drinking water healthy to drink. And in addition to that, we've taken more concrete steps. Like I said, we've requested comment extensions. And going forward through the end of the this initial comment period, hopefully it's extended, we're going to be taking steps to coordinate an advocacy campaign that involves several public interest organizations. So what can other folks do about this? Well, every organization has its own individual capacities and skills, and we would encourage you to draw upon those and leverage them in your own unique ways for one, to raise the profile for this rulemaking with policymakers. You can do that by reaching out to your Hill contacts. We all have a variety of Hill contacts that we've developed over the years. And it's important that we explain why this rulemaking is important, even if it might not seem like it would be immediately relevant to them. Another thing is we can all take steps to begin educating the public and the press about what this rule is and what it means ultimately for the public, for the environmental and public health safeguards that EPA is charged with implementing. And here again, everybody can draw upon their own skills and capacities, do things like draft and place op-eds, publish blogs in various fora, these sorts of things. And lastly, to actually weigh in on the rulemaking itself, we have this effort or this opportunity now to submit comments on the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and there are efforts ongoing right now to help coordinate comments on that. But also, so you can help contribute in that way, or you can somebody might develop a set of sign-on comments, and there again, that would be a good opportunity for your organization to express your concerns about this rulemaking and what it means to you and your members. So I think that covers everything we wanted to cover. Now I think we'll open it up to any questions that the audience might have.
The conference has been unmuted.
Thank you, James and Amy. We're now going to open the floor to questions, as James mentioned. The lines have been unmuted. If you prefer, you can also ask questions in the chat box on your screen. Any chat box questions I will read to the presenters. Please be sure to identify yourself and the organization, agency, or media outlet you're with. Would anyone like to start with the first question?
Well, I can start us off. This is Alice Caswan. I'm also with CPR and a member of the board of directors of CPR and teach at the University of San Francisco School of Law. I have a question about cost-benefit analysis and the extent of the cost analysis that is customary in a cost-benefit analysis. And here I'm building on what Amy Sinden was telling us about the arguments for why you should consider co-benefits. Costs, in a sense, are also ancillary consequences of a rule. But I wondered how broadly costs are considered. Are they usually focused solely on the cost of the regulation to the immediately regulated entity, or are there usually considerations of other types of ancillary costs? And so again, I'm wondering about the ability to argue against the rule by pointing to the breadth of the cost analysis and arguing that the benefits should receive the same kind of breadth. But I just don't know how broad the cost analysis is.
No, Alice, it's a great point. And, of course, one of the things about cost-benefit analysis is that its defenders tend to situate it very much within economic theory and the literature on welfare economics. And that's a very theoretical literature that essentially says anytime government does anything, government should make sure that it's maximizing the net benefits of that action or regulation to society as a whole, which is in essence the definition of efficiency for purposes of, it's a very specific definition for purposes of economics. So it's apparent from that technically speaking, or theoretically speaking, cost-benefit analysis is supposed to look at all of the costs of some, let's say some regulation, to literally every person in society. So this would be the costs to the power plant that's going to have to put scrubbers on their smokestack, right? The cost to the people that own the power plant. But then you're also supposed to look at the extent to which those costs are passed on to consumers, the extent to which those costs might impact the employees of the plant, the extent to which other parts of the economy, I don't know, the people who are selling goods and services to the consumers who now have to pay more for their electricity, let's say, and so they can't pay as much as at the grocery store. Now that's impacting the person that runs the grocery store, and now that's impacting the farmer who's supplying that. I mean, when you start thinking about it, you can see that there are just endless ripple effects from any action that government could take on the cost side and the benefit side. And so a comprehensive analysis of that would literally, I mean, theoretically, you're looking at every single person in society and you're asking, okay, Jane, how much has her net benefit increased or decreased by how much? Has a cost been imposed on Joe by how much? And adding all that up. Nobody thinks you can do that in practice. And in practice, what most economists would say is that, let's say, the cost to the industry of putting the scrubbers on the smokestack, let's say, to reduce pollution levels, can be used as a kind of proxy for all those broader ripple effects on the economy. And that you use that as a kind of just rough cut estimate of how it's going to impact the consumers and the employees and the so-and-so and everybody else. But nonetheless, you can see that you can almost always criticize any particular cost-benefit analysis that has been done in practice for not kind of going far enough out in those ripple effects on either side, on the cost side or the benefit side.
Thank you, Amy. We have a number of questions that are starting to come in through our chat feature. So I'm going to ask a few of those now, and then I'll turn it back over to the open floor. So the first question is from Marsha Mulkey, and the question is, has EPA published any recent cost-benefit analyses, and if in connection with any rulemakings, and if so, have there been any noticeable changes in approach?
Well, that's a great question, and I think, James, do you want to take the first stab at that, since you, for example, I'm thinking of the WOTUS rule. James?
EPA has already taken some initial steps at with its recent cost-benefit analyses that appear to be implementing what this rule is designed to accomplish. And I think the co-benefits issue is a good example of that. So where we saw that was with the repeal of the Obama-era Clean Power Plan to limit greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. They conducted a variety of cost-benefit analysis scenarios, several of which excluded certain kinds or treated the issue of cost-benefit or co-benefits, particularly the particulate matter co-benefits, in various ways. And what's remarkable about these different scenarios is that it was the most extreme treatment of these co-benefits, or of the particulate co-benefits, those in which EPA basically ignored them. Those were the only scenarios in which the repeal itself would pass a cost-benefit analysis test. So this just illustrates why this rulemaking is so important from the perspective of EPA accomplishing its deregulatory agenda. But for making these systematic changes in how EPA conducts cost-benefit analyses, these sorts of deregulatory efforts wouldn't pass a cost-benefit analysis test.
Yeah, I mean,
Amy, do you have anything
one
to
of
add
the
to
puzzles of for the Pruitt EPA of trying to do this rollback of all these Obama-era regulations is that the Obama-era regulations, by and large, were supported by cost-benefit analyses done by the Obama EPA that showed the benefits exceeding the costs. So that puts the Pruitt EPA in the position when they want to roll back one of these regulations of digging back into that cost-benefit analysis and trying to change it so that the benefits of repealing the rule, right, essentially the benefits become the costs and the costs become the benefits, and they have to kind of flip the cost-benefit analysis to show an opposite result. And there are a bunch of recent examples where we've seen what some might call a kind of manipulation of the numbers to try to make it come out in support of regulatory repeal.
Thank you. Our next question is a two-parter, and it comes from Celia Wexler. The first part is, which environmental laws bar EPA from considering cost-benefit analysis when regulating? And the second part is, don't the Clean Air Act amendments ask EPA to consider cost-benefit analysis?
So the most prominent example of a statute, there are a number, but I'll just say the most prominent example of one of the statutes barring, well, two prominent examples, barring consideration or barring cost-benefit analysis would be the National Ambient Air Quality Standards under the Clean Air Act. These are nationwide standards for how much pollutant there can be in the ambient air all around us, and the Clean Air Act says those have to be set at the level requisite to protect the public health, period. Statute says nothing about balancing public health concerns against cost concerns. And in the Whitman versus American Trucking opinion that I noted earlier, Justice Scalia said Congress meant what it said, and the fact that they did not mention costs means that EPA is prohibited from considering costs in setting those standards. Another prominent example would be the Endangered Species Act, which, with only very small exceptions, directs the relevant agencies to set standards for protection of endangered species based solely on the benefits to the species and the environment. Wait, there was a second part to the question though, right?
Yeah, the second part to the question was, don't the Clean Air Act amendments ask EPA to consider costs and benefits in rulemaking?
Oh yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. I would like to say a little bit about that. So yeah, no, there's very few statutes. There's a couple, like one or two or three of the big ones, in which Congress actually said something that's been construed that means EPA was supposed to do cost-benefit analysis to set the standard. Most of the time, what Congress did was to tell EPA and the other, or sometimes other agencies, primarily EPA, to set standards at the most stringent level that's technologically and economically feasible. That is to say, let's reduce pollution levels as much as we possibly can within technological and economic limits. The idea there being those standards are always paired with some assessment that says, let's first figure out if there's a threat here. Is this a pollutant that we have reason to believe is causing harm of some kind? But the agency isn't required necessarily to quantify or monetize the amount of harm that the pollutant is causing, i.e. the amount of benefit that would come from reducing it. They just have to be able to show that there is some reason for concern, that there's some significant harm coming from this pollutant or this environmental degradation. And then once that threshold's been passed, the statute will say reduce pollution levels as much as you possibly can within these feasibility limits. That's the vast majority of the standard setting in the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and so on. And I think it's important to stress that those feasibility standards essentially direct the agency to consider both costs and benefits. Right? They have to consider benefits in the sense that they have to at least make a threshold finding that there's going to be some benefit here to reducing this pollutant, that it does cause some harm. And they have to consider costs in terms of what's feasible. But it does not require the agency to directly compare costs and benefits in a way that requires monetization of environmental benefits. And that was a very conscious choice by Congress in the 1970s. And there's a bunch of quotes from legislative history of these various statutes where Congress said cost-benefit analysis, where you directly balance the costs against the benefit, is a bad way to set environmental standards because you cannot measure the environmental benefits. So it's not that the agencies aren't considering both costs and benefits. They are. They're just not doing it in a way that requires this precise, quantified, monetized balancing of the two against each other, and that thereby would get the agency into the weeds of trying to attach dollar figures to things like saving human lives or pulling a species back from the brink of extinction.
Thank you. We are at the 12:45 mark, but I do want to invite people to stay on because we do have a couple of more questions that have come in through the chat feature, and I want to make sure that we get to all of those before we wrap this up. So that's what we're going to do right now. So I'm going to start with two questions that are very similar. They're from Evan Isaacson and Jay Austin. I'm going to read Jay's because it's a little bit more comprehensive here. And Amy, it's asked of you, which is another line of industry attack on co-benefits is to label them double counting and to argue that, for example, any particulate matter benefits were already accounted for in a particular matter regulation, so we shouldn't count them again, in some other regulation. So what is the proper response to that? And then goes on to say, I assume that, among other things, the mercury rule would have additional marginal benefits on PM reduction, and that's what its cost-benefit analysis tries to account for.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. That's a great question, and that's an important point. So yeah, in my very brief synopsis about this co-benefits issue, I said that as a matter of economic theory, there's no question that it's proper to consider co-benefits. And to the extent that you see the issue framed in that way, to suggest that it somehow is improper, that's just simply bad economics. But Jay raises a really important argument that is also being made in favor of this notion that co-benefits should not be counted in the context of particulate matter. And that is the argument that because the National Ambient Air Quality Standards that I already mentioned already set a nationwide standard for the concentration of particulate matter that is allowed to be in the ambient air and that is necessary to requisite to protect the public health. The notion is that to the extent some other Clean Air Act regulation that, let's say, is aimed at reducing levels of mercury or some other hazardous air pollutant, is as a byproduct of that also going to reduce particulate matter levels, but reduce them below the level that the NAAQS has already set. The notion is that, well, it's logically impossible for any reductions in particulate matter that go below the level of the NAAQS to produce any public health benefit, right? Because the notion is the NAAQS have already drawn a line at the point at which reductions in particulate matter are necessary to protect the public health. Any further reductions below that, the argument goes, can't possibly provide any benefit to public health. So that argument treats the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the NAAQS, as a kind of a on-off switch. It acts as though there's a magic level of particulate matter in the ambient air above which there will be harms to public health and below which there will be zero harm to public health. And it also imagines that through the process by which EPA convenes a scientific advisory panel and looks at all the data and figures out what's requisite to protect the public health, that EPA has set the level at exactly that magic line, the level of the NAAQS. And I don't think, it takes more than a few minutes of thought about that and some common sense to see that that's not a very realistic vision of the NAAQS. There isn't some magic line above which there are public health harms and below which there are zero public health harms, right? Undoubtedly, this is a gradual gradation. And so essentially what EPA is saying, to the extent it's counting particulate matter co-benefits that involve reducing particulate matter benefits below the level of the NAAQS, they're simply saying there is additional public health benefit to reducing particulate matter even more. And that's very credible, as I said, given the strength of the epidemiological literature that shows real nasty effects from particulate matter. And of course, new literature is coming in all the time, which is changing the assessment of where that line should be and so on. It's already been ratcheted down by EPA over the past number of decades.
Thanks. So we're going to take one final question from the chat feature. And this one is in relation to the Office of Management and Budget's kind of overarching guidance document on cost-benefit analysis, which I believe is known as Circular A4. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, we have Circular A4 lurking out there from OMB, which applies to executive branch agencies. So the question is, what happens if EPA tries to issue some kind of one-size-fits-all super mandate for all of its rules, and it ends up conflicting with Circular A4?
That raises kind of a peculiar issue with this rulemaking, because we do have this Circular A4 guidance floating around out there, and there is this very realistic risk that what it calls for might conflict with the recommendations of Circular A4. Just by way of background, in 2001, the Office of Management and Budget, which under the executive orders that Amy mentioned earlier, is charged with overseeing agency compliance with cost-benefit analysis requirements, developed Circular A4, and essentially it's this 100-plus page long technical document outlining best practices for conducting cost-benefit analysis.
Including counting co-benefits, right?
Yes,
Sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely right. yeah, that's absolutely right. And in theory, this is where agencies go to figure out how best to do these sorts of things. And and very explicitly, Circular A4 says that one of the good or best practices of cost-benefit analysis is to consider co-benefits. We call them ancillary benefits, but they're talking about the same thing. And that just illustrates one of the potential problems of this rulemaking is what happens when it conflicts with Circular A4 and which gives way. And it also just sort of raises the foundational question of why EPA is doing this at all if OMB has been charged by the President with overseeing agency cost-benefit analysis requirements.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, OIRA's or OMB's authority to issue the Circular A4 essentially stems from the executive order giving OIRA and OMB the duty and the authority to essentially oversee the conduct of these cost-benefit analyses by all of the federal agencies. I get, the authority for this rulemaking, on the other hand, is a bit murky, right? The EPA just kind of gestures in the first paragraph there about a bunch of environmental statutes and sort of vaguely says, well, they tell us to set standards, and so, we need to figure out how to do this cost-benefit analysis. But ultimately, I guess, if this thing were to, let's say, go before a court, there'd be a question of where the authority for whatever it is that EPA does with this rulemaking actually comes from, and to the extent that they're going to have to locate it in some statute or other. To the extent that they do something that broadly appears to require cost-benefit analysis as the standard-setting tool for most or all of their standard setting, they're going to run into some real problems in terms of conflict with the statutes.
Thank you again, Amy and James, and thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us today. As we're closing out the webinar, you'll see on your screen now some additional resources and information on ways to get involved. You'll also be receiving an email shortly after the webinar with all of this information, and we'll be distributing a link to the webinar recording and sharing that on social media in short order. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar.
What the heck?